Hi there, BookTube, and welcome to my weekly wrap-up, which is 3 books, all written by women as it happens. The first is Fever Dream by Samanta Schweblin, a book from Argentina. The second is A.M. Holmes, The End of Alice. And we have Where Reasons End by Yuylin. I'm going to start with Schweblin, which turned into an impromptu buddy read because reading companion Tina, who I believe used to have a BookTube channel but doesn't currently, she posted a comment on my haul video where I hauled this, and she says, "Oh, that's been sitting on my TBR. Let's buddy read it." So at the drop of a hat, we did, and I think we had similar feelings. I mean, I'm always reluctant to sort of talk for the other person in a buddy read. But I was quite disappointed in this, really. It has a fantastic hook to start off with, where a mother is sort of down by the river with her son, and they're trying to sort of get back this sort of not pedigree horse, sort of a racehorse. So yeah, I think that is that pedigree anyway. That has bolted from their field, and the horse drinks from the water, and she sees her son do the same thing, and they realise that there's a dead bird in the water, and the horse gets sick, and the mother's very worried that the son will get sick, and he does. Obviously, the horse and the son have both been poisoned by you assume the dead bird, and all the sort of bacteria and germs that come from dead bodies, and they sort of managed to find a sort of not a faith healer, almost like a shaman or a white witch, who says, well, the only way you can stop the poison having the same effect that it has on the horse and being fatal is to basically sort of dilute it, split it into two, and the way to do that is you sort of have to perform a half exorcism, whereby you conduct half the spirit of the boy into another human vessel, so that the poison only has half its power. So this is a really interesting setup. So you've got the notion of one character being split into two different bodies, although it's never explicitly told until towards the end who that second body is. So, it's a great setup, but then I think what works against the book is its structure, because that boy is communicating with the mother, not his own mother, but a mother who has a little girl, who the mother is exceedingly protective towards the girl. And she describes it as a rescue distance that she always calculates, given where they are in the environment or whatever, the distance between her and her child that she can make in time to protect the child from any sort of danger that falls on the child. So essentially it's a book about mothers sort of protectiveness towards children, and that push-pull of letting the child have their space, develop, and taste their own independence and explore the world in their own right, versus protection from the parent and not letting them have that space, which is a really interesting theme. It's one that my current novel deals with, but as I say, I think the structure works against it, because the structure is sort of, there's 3 different time sort of periods of the narrative, and the one that's sort of the most further advanced is the boy who was affected, who was poisoned, who did survive but is very weird, presumably because he's only got half his character, half his personality. He is sat by the hospital bed of the mother of the daughter, and she is sort of relaying events in a sort of bit of a fever dream, hence the title, because she's been struck down with something that's not clear. But he's very impatient. He keeps sort of trying to hurry her up, get to the point. That's not relevant. That's not important. And this becomes very tiresome, very repetitive. And also the notion that we are being told of past events are very consciously being retold, and it doesn't have the energy. It doesn't have the real-time energy and movement and fluidity. It's sort of being dragged out of her in her hospital bed. So none of that really works. And as to what the book is about, is it supernatural? is it some sort of message about sort of environmental disaster of poison in the water and all that stuff? Well, no, because there was, it seemed to be caused by a dead bird had polluted the water, which would happen all the time in nature. So I wasn't quite clear what it was trying to say, and the fact that it was about mothers and children and protection versus letting them go in the independence, and then the last part of the novel was resolved by the two fathers of the two women. The one, the one who has the poisoned son as a child, and the one who's trying to protect her daughter. The two fathers sort of end up, sort of concluding the novel, and they're absentee fathers essentially. I mean, the whole point about the horse right at the beginning is, that was the sort of obsession and livelihood of the father. He was never really around. He was always involved with the horse. So they can't carry the weight because they've not been present. So all in all, I found this quite unsatisfactory. I gave it 3 stars, but it didn't really work for me. On to Where Reasons End, Yiyun Li, which is an altogether different kettle of fish. This is a beautiful, delicate novel. It's not perfect, although I gave it 5 stars, and I'll explain why in the course of this review. So essentially, it's a mother who is a writer, whose son, who's called himself Nikolai, he sort of reinvented himself. It's not his actual birth name. He has committed suicide at age 16. And the whole book is a discussion between them, or a catechism between them, whereby she is keeping him alive in whatever level within this book. So she's writing about him, so maybe it's just that she's keeping him alive within the pages of the book that she's writing. But the really interesting thing is that he's really critical of her as a writer, as a mother, as a person. In this debate between them, he's countering everything that she says, and she's very much on the back foot, I feel. Now, is that him sort of going, "You've got to let me go, I'm dead," so that he's trying to shut this down? So that could be one reading of it. Or is it that she's not up to the job, she's not a good writer, she wasn't a good mother, she'll never understand, all this writing and trying to sort of get to the bottom of why he did what he did. And he's sort of implying that, she never understood him, she never will, she's not a good writer or good enough writer to be able to penetrate, why he did what he did. Or is it simply that she's writing both parts, he's dead, so she's writing his part, and he's slamming her, really. He's not being violent and he's not being abusive. It's done, he's doing it through reason. Is that her own guilt talking? That, she's sort of, she's slamming herself. It's not the son who's slamming her because he's dead. It's really, she's projecting into him, in order to sort of express her guilt that she didn't understand him. And she can't, she didn't see any of the red flags as to led up to why he did what he did. So that is what the book is about. Because she's a writer, because she's struggling to understand, she's very much, there's a lot in this book about looking up the meaning of the etymology, the origin of words, trying to nail down, with precision in order to be able to get to the bottom of this. And the son is attacking a lot of that. And, I'm going to come to the two reasons why you might not quite enjoy this book as much as I did. First of all, I'm a writer. So if someone is writing about words and word origins and really sort of, drilling down into trying to make it precise, because language, often isn't good enough. The language that we have, the everyday language we have, it's not precise enough. So I appreciate that as a writer, but I can see that not everyone, it's almost like, well, she's sort of showing off, or she has literally gone to the dictionary to study this and she's just reproducing it. Where's the skill in that? Now, I don't feel that, but I think, it's perfectly valid if readers do. And the other thing is, and I'm going to read a couple of sections of this to illustrate, why I love this book. But also, the dialogue in here is not spoken dialogue. In a way, we know it's written, it's the mother writing it in her book, but it's not realistic dialogue. People do not speak like this. People do not hold sort of intellectual discussions, debating, the roots and origins of words. At least not in everyday life, they don't. And at times this reads almost like sort of one of Plato's dialogues, Socratic dialogues. Now again, that didn't bother me, But again, I can certainly see some people not getting on with that, saying, well, this is wholly unrealistic. As I say, for me, because she was writing it, all this is written. This book in a way is the novel that she's writing within the pages of this book. It worked for me because it's not dialogue, or it's written dialogue. It's literary dialogue, or fictional dialogue, or art, artifice dialogue. So I didn't mind it, but again, I can see that some people might not get on with that. But overall, I just thought the tone and the way this was pitched was so delicately precise and beautiful. And I just want to finish off with a couple of reading sections just to give you an idea of what I was saying. I wasn't a patient person, neither was Nikolai. The root of patience comes from Latin, to suffer or suffering. What are other words that link pain to time, time to pain? Nostalgia, Nikolai asked. Nostalgia, home plus pain. Does he ever feel nostalgic, I thought. I didn't leave home, Mummy, he said. Still, I wish I had taught you how to postpone suffering. If you haven't learned it yourself, you can't teach me, he said. So that's an example of him sort of chiding her and rebutting her and sort of, slamming her arguments. And again, another example. So one of the things that Nikolai did, he was quite a precocious child. One of the things he did is he baked stuff. He baked cakes and pastries and all that sort of thing. I told him that the word monument came from Latin, monumentum, meaning a memorial, and monera, to remind. I had looked it up, along with mind and memory and mourn. Many words had to be relearned since his death. Do you need a monument to remember me? I would rather you were reminded of me by a piece of cheesecake. Because you're a baker, not an architect. Because cheesecake is perishable, he said. Oh, I said, I've never used perishable in my writing. Better than that word you never tire of using, inevitable. They are different adjectives. I prefer a world made of the perishable, he said, not the inevitable. Inevitable makes time more bearable, I thought. Time doesn't make sense if not for the perishable, he said. Okay, I said, we can have different opinions. So that encapsulates, for me, the delicacy and the precision of this book and its beauty. But equally, as I said, given the two caveats I made of, if you're a different type of reader or you have different tastes, why you might not like it. But for me, this is 5-star. I love this book. And before we do the third book, I'm going to say trigger warning because of the subject matter of this book. I'm not going to talk too much in detail about it because it is, it's tricky. But basically, if you didn't like Lolita by Nabokov or you refuse to read Lolita, you ain't going to like this book. So I suggest, you probably hit the stop button and not go any further. So this is called The End of Alice by A.M. Holmes, who's a writer I've read 2 previous novels by. And, she struck me in a sort of the David Lynch sort of she writes about suburbia. She writes about the dark side, the underside that you don't see when you lift the stone of suburbia, like Lynch does. But the difference between Holmes and Lynch, or at least Holmes in those 2 books, was she wasn't quite as sort of phantasmagoric as Lynch. It wasn't such a sort of violent veer towards strangeness. With Holmes, it was almost like, well, this is normality. This goes on. You just don't notice it. The moment you lift the stone, then you notice it. And almost that it's inevitable, you get these very strange, sudden acts of violence. They're only surprising beforehand at the time, but when you look back on it, they're not surprising at all. You can trace their genesis. So Holmes seems to be very much a sort of matter-of-fact tone in how she approaches this as part of her the arguments that she's making about suburbia. This is much more artful and arty and literary. So I was a bit surprised by that. I wasn't expecting that. So basically, it is a paedophile who's in prison, been in prison a long time, and he's writing letters and exchanging letters with a 19-year-old girl who's at at university. Who seems to be on a bit of a hiatus, or she's on during the vacation. I'm not exactly sure. and she is having feelings towards a 12-year-old boy, so that's why she's exchanging letters with him. So that is the book, and I think it. The difference between this and Lolita is, I said that Holmes was surprisingly sort of arch and arty in this, but she's much more also to the point. What molestation, what child abuse actually looks like. I mean, she describes acts of child abuse. She also describes acts of violation in prison. So it's pretty brutal stuff, but brilliantly done. And I think that's the point. That's the difference between this and Lolita in my mind, is this has been written by a woman. And not only has it been written by a woman, but it has a male paedophile and a female paedophile presented. And I think that makes a difference. I think there's so much merit to this book. It's difficult, it's troubling, of course, but I actually think it gets to grips with the subject. The psychology of the girl, and I'm not going to spoil it, but the psychology of the girl molester, of the 12-year-old boy, I thought was just supremely well done. And it's only towards the end where you get the story of the male paedophile and how he abused his child victim, who was called Alice. Then that gets a bit unpleasantly voyeuristic, I suppose. I think with the girl molester, I think there's all sorts of stuff that made you think, because you probably hadn't given much thought to, in women. With the male child molester, although it was supremely well written, it was still, well, that's kind of what you'd expect it to look like. What are we learning about this? I'm not sure we're learning anything. Therefore, it just becomes sort of unpleasant. But as a whole, I gave this 5 stars because, particularly the character of the girl molester, I thought was eye-opening and credible. It's very hard to get into the mind of someone like, who is a child molester. But I could believe it. I mean, unfortunately, I could believe the male as well, because that was well written. But that had sort of that was too black and white, and it was all black. Whereas with the girl, it was much more shades of grey. And I'm just going to read 2 bits, and don't worry, neither of them are sexual in nature. But for me, Holmes is a great stylist. She's a great wordsmith as well. So this is about the prisoner in jail, and you probably don't want to feel sympathy for him, but this is a very good piece of writing on ageing. And look at me now. The skin that every summer broke out in freckles is awash in liver spots. The mat on my chest has gone silver, spare, wiry like steel wool. It is the wiring of death, my own wiring breaking through the skin. My body is softening, spilling out over the edges. Everything attractive has disappeared. And, a very simple, this is the description of the prison that he's in that there's obviously 4, north, south, east, west wings, and all the sex offenders are put in the west wing, which is obviously where he is. We are kept in a special section for the sexuals. Car thieves, petty larcenists and common murderers will have nothing to do with us, and so, to keep the calm, the cool, we are kept entirely apart, and are therefore all too easily forgotten. The visitor centre is in the crossroads. East meets west, north meets south, and you can tell who's who by the jewellery that they wear. And I think that's a brilliant metaphor, because they're not wearing jewellery. It's the chains, the amount of chains. Do they just have handcuffs? Do they have ankle chains? Do they have chains wrapped around their stomach of which their hands are chained? And it's the sexuals who have the most chains, because they are not allowed to touch anyone, come into contact with anyone. Even though a murderer, we think could be potentially more of a threat to a prison warder or whatever. No, it's the sexuals who wear the most jewellery, i.e. have the most leg irons and chains. I just think little things like that just made this book, just took it up to the next level. So there you have it. That's my Friday reads. Fever Dream, 3 stars. And then 2 5-star reads in very different ways. Beautiful, delicate, quite intimate, and brutal. But both very, very fine reads. And you know, I've done a weekly wrap up pretty much every week since the start of the year, or at least the second week of January. I've read about 21 books in all, and I've reviewed 20 of them. The only one I haven't is a graphic novel. Um, but I'm not sure I'm going to be able to keep that up, at least in the month of March, because I'm doing the March of the Mammoths, whereby we are reading, it's a readathon for where you're encouraged to read a book of 800 or more pages. And I'm doing David Foster Wallace's The Infinite Jest. And, you know, that will probably take me a good chunk of March. So there will not be weekly wrap-ups. I will not be reading anything in parallel, except maybe some non-fiction in the bath. But I certainly won't be reading any other fiction while I'm battling my way through the 1,000 pages of that. So, you know, I think the weekly wrap-up is going on a hiatus for a month or so. But one video I'm going to mark your cards to watch this space is I've now received the 3 bits of fancy dress for which I require to do this video, and I will be shooting it sometime in the near future. It should hopefully come out in March. So that will be a little bit of content that's a bit different. Okay, so till next time, and I'm not quite sure what that's going to involve, whether that will be an update on my progress through The Infinite Jest. I'm a little reluctant to do updates, progress through books, because you can be made to look very foolish where you go, I didn't like this, or I didn't understand that, or that means that, and then, 100 pages later you find you've got it completely wrong. So I don't know if I'm going to do update videos, because I haven't got anything else in parallel that I'm reading. If I just sort of say, I'm on page 200, there's nothing else to say. It's not a video. And as I say, because I've got nothing else in parallel, I can't, bring that to the video. So I'm not sure when I'll next see you. Okay, until whenever that is, next time.